Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, I'd like to share with you a recent game that I've seen being played by the Norwegian Grandmaster Hammer and the reigning world champion Vishy Anand. Let's look at this game in depth. It's quite interesting how in the sea of complications even top players as the reigning world champion and his opponent can make mistakes. Of course, just to be fair, it's important to add that it was a rapid game, so they haven't had hours to think about the position. But let's talk about what's important here is, and namely, the key element is that neither king is quite safe. It was black's turn, and even though white is up 2 pawns, white needs to be rather careful not to get in trouble. So the most natural move, which black continued with, is to play bishop b7 and indeed to position the bishop on this powerful light square diagonal where white has earlier in the game already weakened himself by playing g3. Of course, if white would have a bishop on g2, then none of this would be a problem because there wouldn't be any weakness that we're talking about. But right now, since there is nothing in that black's bishop's way on the entire diagonal, that can create serious danger. For example, if the black queen would succeed to get in front of its bishop to c6 or to f3, but obviously in a way that the queen will not be captured, that would create immediate checkmate threats on g2 and h1. So this is the key situation here, that white by all means needs to try to avoid allowing the black queen to create those threats. Here in the game, white continued with c4, which was an immediate big mistake. Before we go further, let's look at some other options that white had instead. One option was trying to retreat the queen to e3, which on one hand threatens to go down to e8 and create his own threats, or also prepares ideas such as if queen c6 to play f3. Remember, white is up 2 pawns, so if by giving one of those 2 extra pawns up, white could achieve the exchange of queens, that would certainly be excellent news for white. Now, let's go back. After bishop b7 and if queen e3, now the black king captures the bishop, then checkmate arrives with queen e8. So obviously that'd be a huge blunder for black. And the best choice that black right now has is to capture first the pawn on a2. Then now white is free to retreat the bishop, and after queen d5, again the idea is to play f3, giving up even a second pawn, but balance the position out, and if queens are off the board, white with equal material is of course in no danger whatsoever. It's important to point out that the immediate attempt to exchange queens with queen e6 check would be a huge blunder, as after the exchange of queens, black would get to checkmate right away in the corner. Okay, so after seeing all of this, let's go back to the position after bishop b7. So we saw that queen e3 leads to a playable position, but white can actually try to be proactive, in fact himself, and make a sacrifice with bishop g7. Now this leads to very interesting complications, and I suggest you take some time on your own, naturally, without any computer help, on your own, trying to figure out the complications and where they lead. Then compare my comments about the position. If now the rook captures, it pretty much results in similar positions as if the king would after rook e7, takes, and we'll see pretty similar lines after bishop b7, bishop g7, and now rook g7. You'll see we'll get to that same scenario. rook e8. Now it's already black who needs to be careful. The king needs to go only to f7. If it would go to h7, white would win right away. After check, forcing the rook to block, and then rook e7 and the rook falls. So let's go back a couple moves and see the correct move. King f7. Now rook e7 check, king g6, rook g7, king g7, and now we can see that we got to the same position as we could have if the black king would have captured right away the bishop. Now if black wants to avoid perpetual checks after queen e8 and queen e7, the king needs to try to go up. So at the moment white has 3 pawns for the bishop, which generally is sufficient. However, white can actually force a draw by perpetual checks. So keep giving the checks on e8. And now if black wants to try to play for a win, then the king needs to move upward towards the 5th rank, but needs to be really careful avoiding getting checkmated. If the king would move right now to f5, that would be an immediate blunder, because now white to move and win. For example, after g4, king f4, checkmate arrives beautifully with queen e3. Or if the king moves to g5 instead, let me move back the pieces, king g5, then checkmate in 2 moves comes with queen h5, king f4, and queen f5. Let's go back just a bit. After king g7, queen e7, king g6, queen e8, black can try king g5, but here again it's only black who is putting himself to danger. f4, king f5, check, king e4, queen d4, king f3, and black cannot avoid the perpetual checks that would continue. Of course, blocking the check is suicidal, as black loses the queen after g4. Okay, so let's go all the way back and look at the position after bishop b7, and white made a big mistake by playing c4. Looks like a normal move, and in fact the black queen cannot get to the long diagonal at the moment without allowing the exchange of queens, so it seems like things are under control. However, here was the first opportunity that Anand missed to win the game right away. Well, here the beautiful move that was missed was a queen sacrifice with queen e6. Very impressive move with an idea that we already saw in an earlier variation. If rook takes, rook check, and then followed by checkmate in the corner. Naturally, after black playing queen e6 and sacrificing the queen, white is not forced to capture the queen. However, the problem is that in reality the queen e6 move is a double attack. On one hand, it of course attacks the rook, and on the other hand, for example, if the rook moves away, it also threatens to capture on h3. The problem is that the threats are deadly now on g2 and h1, and if white would try to close up the diagonal, then queen g3 would follow up with check, and then bishop f3, and it's game over. White gets checkmated within a few moves. So let's go back again to our game after c4, and this was the first moment where both sides started to make mistakes. Anand, instead of playing the beautiful queen e6, captured white's pawn on a2, and this, had white played correctly, would have given white the opportunity to come back to the game and survive. White here should have played queen h5, which covers important squares like e2 and f3, and of course still has ideas of getting to e8. For example, if now queen takes e4, now the bishop can retreat and black doesn't have the time to capture the bishop, because then white could play rook e8 and then fork the rook. Of course, immediate fork is okay too, but this is even better, because now after queen f5 it's not only a fork, but after g6, queen takes rook, black gets checkmated. So that's serious business. Going back to the position after c4, and we were talking about queen takes a2, which happened in the game, and now that white should have played queen h5, queen c4, and then retreat the bishop to b4, opening up the e8 square for the rook or the queen to arrive with a check. And now after queen c6, white can continue with rook e8 check, king h7, queen f5 check, g6, and now when all seems to be lost, nothing is lost, because white can transpose to a drawn endgame after the forcing exchanges of rooks and queens. Well, of course, it's much easier to find these moves in the piece of the home and analysis and the help of the computer, compared to during a game when both sides are short on time. However, the game continued with queen f5, which was another mistake. Looks like a good move because it gains time, seemingly attacking black's rook, and also threatens with a potential check on e6. And black also answered with a mistake, again missing that same idea, that same pattern that black missed on the previous move. This time the queen can and should have moved to e2. What a brilliant move again, the same idea. If the rook leaves the first rank and captures the queen, the black rook comes down and then checkmates in the corner. In the meantime, black of course threatens to capture white's rook on e1. So white is in a serious situation, and for example, after queen b1, the problem is the black queen gets to that diagonal, and a beautiful battery has been created between the queen and the bishop, and white will either get checkmated or will have to give up major material like the queen. Let's try other resources, for example moving the rook away to f1. Now the problem is that the black rook will come down to d1, and again similar problems. After rook takes, queen takes, now the queen will checkmate in the corner. So this doesn't help really either. So going back one more time, after queen e2, relatively the best response is to play bishop b4 and protect the rook this way. Also remember, this didn't only protect the rook, but now actually the black queen is under attack, because if it was white's turn now, after rook captures queen and the black rook comes down to d1 to check, then the white bishop or rook can block coming back to e1. But black can do better, again come down with the rook d1. Similar problems, if rook exchanges, queen captures back, and then checkmate comes in the corner. So white must look for a way to hang on to the rook staying on e1 and protect it with queen a5. And the problem with this one is that now this enables the black queen again to get to that magic diagonal and play, for example, queen e4 with killer threats on g2 and h1. White has no choice but start running. Now black can simply pick up a pawn and then come back with more threats. And now after king f1, start chasing the king out to the middle of the board. And now with a simple move, rook d4, black will maintain a winning attack, and white's position is pretty much hopeless. So let's go back again. We saw now for a second time Anand missed the winning opportunity and played the defensive move queen a4. This gives white again the opportunity to get back to the game, and that's exactly what white did by playing queen e6 check. A tricky move, because if king captures the bishop, then checkmate on e8. So the king had to leave and go to h7. And now white could have retreated the bishop, for example to b4, which is a rather tricky move, because if now queen captures, then not queen takes rook, which would hang the rook on e1, but first a check with the queen, and if the pawn blocks, then already the queen captures the rook with a check, or if king g8, then first rook e8 check moves the rook away from danger and then captures the rook. In the meantime, after bishop b4, white is up a pawn, and the queen doesn't have a way to get to that magic long diagonal of light squares. Of course, it could, but that would allow the exchange of queens, and then white would be better. Instead, white made kind of a so-called time pressure move. King h2, just kind of make a move because the clock is ticking. And it's still, white is in the game. No problems. Queen c2, bishop came to defend the pawn on f2, and came rook d2. So now black again has concrete and immediate threats, namely to capture the pawn on f2, and then if bishop takes, queen takes, that would be checkmate. And white made a very natural move by playing king g1, protecting the f2 square. A better way, a much better way, was actually to play queen b6. Not only because this move protects the f2 square as well, but more importantly, it attacks the black bishop, and once that bishop moves, white would be ready to force the exchange of the queens. And of course, that's half victory for white, because without the queens, black's attack is not dangerous at all. So let's go back and see how the actual game continued. After black played rook d2 and white responded with king g1. Black played right now queen d3. Well, a natural move, threatening with queen f3. So the question is now what to do. White made a tricky looking move, but actually it was a serious mistake. White can try to protect that square directly or come up with a creative plan, which actually white chose. Turns out the best way to play here was to retreat the queen to e3, offer the exchange of queens, and of course if queen takes pawn on c4, then the rook is hanging on d2, and if the queen retreats to d7, then white can again move the king back to h2, and for example queen c6 could be answered with rook g1. Looks a bit passive, I certainly have to admit, but it seems that white survives, and after rook d1, naturally not capturing the rook, but playing f3. And it seems that white is in the game, barely, but is surviving. Instead, in the game, after black's queen d3 move, white continued with a creative looking g4. Now what's the idea? Simple. If queen f3, to play queen f5 check, and to get rid of the queens, even if white will end up losing a pawn or two, in view of having opposite colored bishops on the board, it's a realistic chance to save the game. The problem is white will never get there. Black played rook d1, an excellent choice, because if now rook takes rook, queen takes, king h2, queen comes to the corner, and the king chase will not end well for white. Now if king f4, checkmate arrives immediately, or if the king goes the other direction to h4, then first g5 and then queen h3. Very nice checkmate. Let's go back to the position after rook d1, where white played better by not capturing, of course, on d1, but playing bishop b4. Now the hope still is that if queen f3, then queen f5, If rook trades, the bishop can capture back. The problem now is that black can and should have captured simply the pawn on h3, because here the queen, just like from f3, renews the checkmate threat of queen g2 or queen h1. However, it stepped away from the queen f5 check, forcing the exchange of queens. Here black would just play g6 and white is in trouble. Remember, the rook on e1 is in a pin, therefore cannot go to e7 to check, and white is lost. Let's go back another time. And after bishop b4, black made yet another inaccuracy by trading rooks first. And now took on h3, came queen f5 check, king h8, and f3. Even though white has a much longer game and can fight, of course, black is still in a winning position, not by capturing with the bishop, because that would allow draw by perpetual checks after queen c8, and then coming back to f5, and even after g6, just keep checking constantly. But as black continued in the actual game by capturing on f3 with the queen, and for the first time indeed allowing the exchange of the queens, because it means that white is losing all the kingside pawns and it will leave black with 3 connected passed pawns, and it pretty much guarantees a win. Black won the game. Of course, it was much better not to trade rooks first, but take on h3 immediately, because then it wouldn't be any worry about a long endgame and technicalities and how to win it. A very interesting game, and the whole point of this example is to stress the importance of the weakness of the long diagonal, especially when your king has castled there and you have already fianchettoed, but the bishop is gone. So you played a g3 move like in this game, and all those light squares were weak. You saw how many tactical opportunities it allowed for black because of those weakened light squares, especially when there is a bishop that can occupy that long diagonal with the help of the queen. It's extremely dangerous. And now let's see the jewel of the week. Here we are. In this position it is white's move, and the question is how to win the game despite having material disadvantage. Well, actually the first 2 moves are pretty easy, and in fact the trick is to find black's counterplay. So I suggest, before you listen further, you try to figure out the correct sequence, and for black also the correct defense on how this position should continue. Actually, the first move, as I said, is very natural. Pushing the pawn to b7. White now is about to promote the pawn to a queen. If the black rook would come down to d8, stopping the pawn, bishop c8 would solve the issues easily. And then, if black checks with the rook, the king simply gets closer to the black rook, and checks are over, the pawn will get promoted. So after b7, amazingly, black has a very resourceful defense by checking and then bringing the rook down to a8. Pretty impressive. Now, if the pawn captures the rook and promotes it to a queen, all of a sudden it's game over, it's stalemate. Wow, pretty unusual, isn't it? Same would happen if the pawn captures the rook and promotes to a rook. Amazingly, if the pawn captures the rook and promotes to a knight, black escapes by forking white's bishop and knight, and if now knight takes knight, another different beautiful stalemate. How impressive is that? On the other hand, the only winning move is to capture and promote the pawn to a bishop. Pretty unusual, having two light squared bishops. However, as computer analysis have shown, it is a objectively won endgame. Having, of course, an extra pawn helps. A pretty impressive study composed by Grandmaster Pachman. Thank you for listening. Hope you enjoyed the lesson. And you remember those long diagonals. When there are weak squares, it's extremely dangerous for your king. Thank you, and be back next week for some more chess knowledge.